today. He served as chairman of the 1985 New York Convention and is past president of the New York Thursday Nights chapter. He ran first-class sign auctions for 10 years. Let's give him a nice, warm FBI welcome from Ron Fox.
Good morning. Okay, I'm sure we're all having a great time. I know I am. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I'm just going to sit here. It's a lot easier. First, I'd like to thank Mike Wall. This is a visual presentation, and without his ability to take great slides, it wouldn't be possible. What I'm trying to do this morning is I'm going to talk about glass and the enameling on glass. I'm going to use sort of a timeline visually to bring us up to the period that most of us collect, which is the later 19th century enameled glass. I'm going to try to separate it down where it's into factories that some of us are aware of, some of us are not. There are factory names that we've heard quite a bit, and I guess this morning you're going to hear of a couple of the factory names that some of you probably have never heard before, and hopefully visually you'll get an idea of the traits of each, so you can see what differentiates one factory from another. Basically, the metropolis of glassmaking in the 15th and 16th century was in Venice, Italy. Anybody that wanted to buy glass throughout Europe, that's where it stemmed from. If you were an apprentice or you were doing and making glass at the time, it was quite competitive. So for that reason and other reasons, some of the glass workers migrated up into North Italy, up in Bohemia, into Germany, because if they wanted to go into their own business, they had to do that because it was so competitive in Venice. So now you've got people taking those traits and techniques, going north and going west, bringing their abilities and settling in areas where the raw materials were suitable to what they were going to do. Basically, we need to start out with the question, what is enamel? Basically, if they're going to make enamel, they take already made glass and they grind it into a powder or a frit. They would take metallic oxides, they would mix those metallic oxides with the ground up glass or the powdered glass. They would use an oil to make it paintable, so it would flow together. You could put it on a brush and you could paint like an artist. They would then paint it onto the body of the glass and put it back in the kiln, and they'd refire it or reheat it, more proper word. What would happen is when they brought it up to almost the same temperature that the glass was made at, the powder would liquefy or vitrify into a sheet of glass and attach itself to the body that it was painted onto. So in essence, the enamel is glass. It has color and it has density and it has thickness, but in reality, it in itself is glass. If you've ever seen the handle attached to a glass tine, you'll see that the only adhesiveness that it needs is the heat and the temperature of the glass. So when they attach a handle to the glass body, because they're both at a very high temperature, they immediately attach themselves, and you don't need anything else other than that heat. It's the same thing with the enamel. When it gets heated up, it flows and attaches itself to the body. You very, very rarely will see any kind of flaking or wear to enamel. It just is very durable. There's basically two types of enamel. You've got opaque enamel, which will not allow the light to pass through it, so the color that it is will cover up the underlying color of the glass body. The other type of enamel is transparent enamel. It's much thinner. There's more oxide than there is powdered glass, and that's the difference. And it allows more light, and in most cases a lot of light, to pass through that thin layer to the glass body. And in most cases, if the body of the glass is very transparent, you can see through the enamel and the glass to the other side. Again, the thing that changes opaque enamel to transparent enamel is the degree of powdered glass they put in there. The more powdered glass they put in, to the ratio of the metallic oxide will determine whether it's opaque and transparent. When I say a metallic oxide, just to emphasize the point, if you wanted to have a yellow enamel, you would put chromium oxide into the mix. If you wanted to have green enamel, you would put copper oxide into the mix. If you wanted to have blue, you put cobalt oxide, and so on and so forth. The only other thing that I would have mentioned, in the 15th century, in the early period in Venice, when they wanted to have a decoration on glass, they had lacquer enamel or lacquer paints. It basically was paint similar to what you put on wood or anything at the time. It did not need to be put into an oven and reheated. It subsequently wore off. So when you see a piece of glass that's early and most of the decoration is worn, you know that that's not fired on enamel, it's cold decoration. They did the same thing on faience. And those of you that collect the early pieces know that Shred-Sign and some of the other factories, Krell-Sign, did some cold decoration. But as they developed enamel, there was no reason to use a cold decoration. Okay. Pretty much when I put the talk together, I want to make it relative to what we collect, so I kept it in the line of drinking vessels as much as I can. There are some additions that are not steins or drinking vessels only because that's what I needed to emphasize the traits. So we're going to start in the 16th, late 15th, late 16th, and early 17th century, and this is the type of enamel that was developed. You had Pokals and Humpins and Steins. A lot of heraldic crest and shields. That was the motif that you mostly see. This is a late 17th century tankard with the same kind of enamel. Instead of it being on clear glass, you have it on cobalt. But you're getting a feel for the type of enamel that you're going to see during that period. Here you have something that's historical. You've got the crucifixion, and then I'm sure it's relative to something else there with the verse. You'll find a lot of pieces at that time were made for families and occasions. This type of enamel ran through from the 16th to the mid to late 17th century. It was a type of enameling that you would find on glass no matter what the form was. And this piece here is right around the turn. It's right around 1800. When you lapsed into the 19th century, things changed a bit. In the 18th century, even though you would find pieces like this, it was a lot more uncommon. This type of enamel normally was 16th and 17th century. In the 18th century, with the development of wheel cutting technique was much more desirable and sought after than enameling. So you sort of had a lapse where you didn't find as much enameling on glass during the 18th century as you had the previous century. So this is kind of my timeline to bring you up to the late 19th century. When you get to about 1810 to about 1830 in what's the town? Not Venice. In Austria, Vienna. I know it was a V. Okay, in Vienna, you had two glassmakers that worked with hand-painted enamel with some transferring, and that was Anton Kutgasse, which this is, and Samuel Bone. And they were always beakers and tumblers for the most part, and they were souvenir pieces made for the tourists that came to Vienna at that time, and most of them showed scenes of the European cities. When you get to about 1830 to about 1860, there's a type of enamel that the Europeans call pasty enamel. Now, I know for many of you that's a new term, but it's a term that's widely used in Europe and a lot of the glass books. Now, pasty enamel, to differentiate that from what you've seen previously on the humpins and the glass signs from the 17th century, they use an awful lot of gold and silver, and sometimes it actually looks pasty. It's like an off-white or cream. Even though this one here is multicolored, it still falls into that category. The pasty enamel, for the most part, fell into that time period between 1830 to 1860, and usually was on opalines. I've got quite a few pieces here that will show you that that time period, opaline glass was quite in vogue, and you didn't see the transparent glass as much during this time period, especially those pieces that were enameled. Here's a close-up to show you. If you look at the gold leaves, you can see why they called it pasty enamel. Here's a uranium glass piece. It's green uranium. The uranium came in several colors, both yellow and green, and recently I had a blue uranium, also very sought after at that time. Here's a piece also that really shows you what they mean by the pasty enamel. That off-white and yellowy with gold highlights and a lot of times with silver highlights. This piece has both the gold and the silver. This piece here, you can see the enamel looks black, but in reality it's silver, and it's been tarnished by oxidation. The same thing with this piece. The enamel on this also was silver at one time, and it's gotten very dark. You can actually take a silver polish and go over that, and that dark floral pattern would turn silver again. Again, if you see the dark areas over the cut work there, that was silver at one time. Now, all this enamel on these opalines are called pasty enamel. Again, you see the silver and the gold. In the 17th century, a type of enamel that was called Schwarzrot was basically black enamel. Artists like Ignaz Preissler worked in that medium exclusively. It was very fashionable. Occasionally, you'll see a piece that's done in a red sepia, tones of brown and black. Pieces like that bring 50,000, 70,000, 100,000, just give you an idea of how sought after it is. Anybody that goes to the V&A in London, Victoria Albert Museum, there's several very good examples in a showcase there in the glass exhibit of the multicolored enamel by Ignaz Preissler. This piece is done by Lobmeyer, even though it's not a 17th century. This type of black enamel was revived in the Historicism period. This piece also is late 19th century, but with it on 3-ball feet. It's typical of what they would have made in the 17th century. Now, when I put this slide in, I put it in because it looked like it was black enamel, but if you look real close, it's a red stain. And I didn't want to have a hole, so I left it in there. Okay, here's another piece of the black enamel. I'm just, in the beginning now, showing you different things, different types and different styles. You can't give a specific factory. Now, the factory that made this was Hyder, but some of the previous pieces, you can't be as exclusive about the manufacturer. So we went from the black enamel, now we're going to go to the white enamel, or what is more commonly known, the Mary Gregory type. Now, Mary Gregory was a maker here in the United States, and quite honestly, she didn't make too much of it, and most of it so becomes a type. Sort of like Capodimonte or Royal Vienna. A lot of people did it. It falls into a category, but doesn't fall into one manufacturer. It's a pretty neat subject matter, early car. But basically what you do is almost everything on the piece will be in white enamel, and occasionally the face and the hands will have the flesh tones. And This person's not flesh tones, we have a little bit darker than the Minstrel Man. But for the most part, everything on the piece is going to be in white enamel. You see here the trumpeter, his face is multicolored for the most part, but the rest is all white. So the main thing that you need to know is you can't say that this is any specific factory. Okay, now we're going to start with specific factories. One of them that's pretty well known to most of the Stein collectors is Fritz Heckert. Now, Fritz Heckert, when he first started, his factory was started, there's some discussion on exactly when, but 1865 to 1871, depending upon which book you want to read, he started a glass house. What he had done was, he took not all, but some of the aristocratic children, and it was always a lot of respect for the enamel glass from the 17th century. So in teaching them how to respect it and why they should respect it, they started to make copies of it. And they were so successful because what they did was they would take the wares that they made and they would sell them to help the operating costs of this little glass house. They sold it so well that everybody got graduated and it became a full-fledged glass factory about 5 years later. But what you have is mostly when they started all the heraldic shields and crests for the 18th and 17th century figures and characters on it. For the most part, Fritz Heckert made very few steins. In fact, this glass body had been enhanced by 18th century pewter. The fact was that it never was made with mounts. I've had this piece several times, and it never came out of the factory with mounts. It looks much better with them. Unfortunately, it was never made that way. Here's a side view. Mainly what he did was a lot of beakers, bocals, humpins, and things of that nature, lots of stemware, decanters, bottles, again, lots of shields and crests. And as you can see, most of them will have 17th century dates. They were making actual copies of known pieces that were in museums. They weren't looking to fool anybody, but that's what they would model after. This is 17th century character. Back then, I guess they used snuff. I guess today they would put something else up their nose. Okay, Johnny I spoke on wedding beakers the other day, on marriage cups. One of the makers was Fritz Heckert. He made the vast majority of them. He didn't make all of them. Most of the ones you see with the shields and crests on, or if not all of them, were made by Fritz Heckert. One thing that you can look at when you're looking at Heckert, most of their glass has a lustering to the body to give it an older look. So it was a way of giving the glass an aged look without having to have it be around for 200 or 300 years. But if you look at that, you can see the glass has a slight frosting or iridescence or lustering to it. And that was done chemically in the kiln after the glass was made. Now, there was probably 4 or 5 different factories that used the same metal body, but the glass and the enameling on the glass was done by different factories. Being this talk is set up into factories, we will come across other wedding beakers when we get into those other categories, and I'll show you the difference. This is one that's done by Fritz Heckert, and it's what they call the Russian pattern. And basically, they wheel cut all the outlining of this, and they stained it with transparent enamel, and then they put gold. All the gold outline actually is wheel cut. So every place that there's a gold line around the multicolored designs actually has wheel cutting. So the wheel cutting has gold set into it. And they did this type of work in just about every form. You've got the wedding beakers, this decanter, you've got stemware, you've got bowls with cups and saucers. It was quite a line that they sold a lot to Russia. Russia bought this. This was sort of a Middle Eastern design, a Byzantine design, and they did quite well with it. Here's a really nice goblet. It's quite large. If you look at the way the gold is done and really study that type of gold work you'll see done very often on Fritz Heckert pieces. One good thing about Fritz Heckert is, unlike most of the other glass that was made during this period, he marked the vast majority with the initials FH and then some catalog numbers. So he made it quite easy for us, where some of the other factories made it quite hard. Here you've got like threaded enamel, cavaliers, and then if you look down back at the bottom of each one of the characters, you see the same type of gold work that you've seen on the previous goblet. These are two dwarfs, and again, the quality of the enamel is quite well done. The good thing is, if you put a lot of any factory together, you start to see similarities, and that's hopefully what you'll get to see as you go through many of these slides. He did a whole series of juice glasses, not just with the dwarfs, but he did famous figures, famous artists, and things like that, and it's endless what they made in these juice glasses. Here again is, in Gary's auction yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I lose track of time, there was a similar piece done like this that brought $875, the same exact type of threaded enamel, same exact color of the glass body, and the same lustering. It's quite well done. They did stem wares like this. It's one of their typical patterns. Okay, Fritz Heckert went from doing the Hysterismus glass, or the Revival period glass, through other designs around the turn of the century. And then all of a sudden, right after the turn of the century, Art Nouveau came in. And a lot of the old styles and artwork was no longer desirable. I would say that in the enamel glass factories, they were the leaders in my collection. I've got about over 20 different Art Nouveau enamel vases done by. Each one of these are marked, except for one or two. This is a really nice pair, matching, and you can see down the bottom you've got the water lilies and alligators. Real strong Art Nouveau. This, again, is a real nice piece, dual handles and the flowers. But the one trait that you want to keep and look for on Fritz Heckert is his real strong lustering or iridescence to the body. Very similar to what Lutz did and Tiffany. Tiffany was a much more brassy and shiny lustering, where Lutz and Fritz Heckert was more of a matte finish lustering. I know there's somebody in the audience that collects butterflies because they bought a goblet from me, and I told them that I had quite a few vases with butterflies on them, so they may want to take particular attention to those. This is one of my favorite ones. It's really quite well done. More butterflies. If you look at the iridescence, the real strong patterns and designs, they had quite a line. There were two major artists that were responsible for their Art Nouveau decorations that were put on the glass. You had Max Rada, who did this piece here, and then you had Professor Sudelin, who had a totally different line. This is also Max Rada. This is quite unusual because of the variegated yellow body that the Art Nouveau enamel is on. It's very untypical for Heckert, and most people would not know this to be from that factory. So it's kind of a real exception to the rule. They did an awful lot for the Middle Eastern market. This is something that was made for the Islamic area, and I've been told that those letterings had something about Allah or God. But notice that the vase is actually in a shape. This is the other artist, Professor Sudelin. He didn't do people or scenes of that nature. He did linear work. It was more cell-like, but the cells that were painted in were very Art Nouveau and strong in their influence. This is another piece from Sudelin. Big difference from Max Roder, much harder to find. I don't like it as well. Okay, now we're going to go into Agerman. Agerman was one of the Bohemian firms up north. It is a very famous glassmaker and goes back to the early Agerman, who was responsible for developing a lot of the transparent stains, for developing the uranium glass. So there's a real history in this family of Agerman. Again, what was current at this time, 1875 to 1895, was the heraldic crescent shields done like the early period. And you see that that's pretty much what Agerman did until he got beyond 1900. There was a piece in the auction a couple of days ago that was done the same way, but instead of it being on a green body, which is more typical for Agerman, it was done on a white variegated body. I think it bought about $1,100. You'll also notice that behind the crescent shields, there's what I call a snowflake design, very typical of Agerman. Now, Agerman had quite a range in quality of enamel. Things that were done for the European market were done with much greater quality. Things that they exported to England were done in a very inferior quality. I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but I guess the English didn't have as much taste as the Germans. Again, you'll see sort of the snowflake designs. You'll also see that you have a 1667 date. They weren't looking to fool anybody, but that was the type of things that people really respected in museums, so it sold very well. Another trait of Agerman is they used a lot of fronts, and whereas a lot of the other factories didn't. So you'll find a lot of fronts on Agerman, and then the fronts are usually enameled and decorated. As you can see on this, you've got beaded dot work on the fronts on the glass body. Same as with this here. And they made a variety of shapes and sizes. I tried to do as many steins as I could in the different categories. Agerman did more steins than any of the other glass makers that did enameling, so it was very easy to find them for this category. Again, I thank Mike Wald, who's got quite a library. Without his slide library, it would be impossible. Here you're getting a little bit later and you're getting away from, if you want to follow a timeline in this specific factory, the crescent shields are the earlier part of the factory, and when you start getting into scenics like this, you're getting into the later part of the factory. So if you want to judge age, that's a good way of doing it. And there's exceptions to the rule, but as a general way of looking at it, it's a good way. Here you can see how the fronts are completely painted with a red enamel. Now there's lots of slides, and the repetition of showing the same thing is to hopefully visually ingrain upon you the traits of each factory, so you can say, okay, after you walk out of this talk, you go into the science sale room today and say, okay, this is an Agerman. I recognize it from all the slides that I had to sit through and almost sleep. Now here's a piece that looks like Agerman. I put it in there. In reality, I have my doubts for a lot of reasons. I won't go into them and bore you. But I put it there to make the point that most of the glass was not marked. And it's very hard and nearly impossible, in many cases impossible, to tell you what every single enamel glass piece, where it was made. I can't do it. I don't know anybody that can do it. There was major factories like Heckert and Agerman and Moser, and then you had a lot of little workshops where they bought the glass. Now, the body of this glass piece was certainly made in the same place and probably by Agerman, but I really doubt whether the enameling was done in the house. This is probably a little workshop that bought the blank, decorated it, had it heated and fired, but I don't think it was decorated by Agerman. That's conjecture. Okay, now we're going to get into a factory that is very well known. If you ever go to an antique show, any piece of enameled glass, the dealer's going to say it's a piece of Moser. Well, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but Moser didn't make everything. It seems that's the only name that the antique dealers think that is saleable, so everything with enamel's got to be Moser. Moser had a very distinct style, different than everybody else. They had many different styles, they had many different patterns. This is similar to the fern pattern, and if you look at the body, minus the enamel, it looks like Agerman. But quite honestly, once you look at the enamel and you know enough about Moser, you know that this was decorated by Moser. One other point that I'd like to make is, in the heyday of glass making, especially factories like Moser that had a very large production, they bought a lot of glass from other factories. They bought other lines from other factories, and they had other factories make their line because they couldn't keep up with their demand. So, you know, if you want to get into semantics of who made a specific piece, there was a lot of things made at other factories that Moser marketed, but the lines get blurry sometimes. Here's one of their typical patterns. Anybody that collects Moser knows that the oak leaves and the acorns is very desirable and very expensive. To give you an idea, these little juice tumblers that are only 3.5, 4 inches tall would bring $600, $800 a piece. But it's one of their typical designs. The only other factory that did acorns similar to this was Wend in England, but the acorns are different. Okay, you got back into still with the Moser. This is actually just a little piece about 2.5, 3 inches tall. If you look at the decoration, one thing that Moser did a lot is when they painted over, how do I explain this? Okay, they put the linear enamel lines on with like an off-white or a yellow enamel. Then, if you look at those lines, there's gold that's painted on top of the enamel. And what it does is it gives the gold a raised effect or a threaded effect. And that's how they did it. There's actually a colored enamel beneath the gold. Well, when they painted it, you can see it was with a pretty wide brush, and the gold overlapped the enamel and went onto the flat portion of the glass. So that's one of the traits of Moser. Here's a very heavily decorated piece by Moser, and you can see what I mean. They're very heavy-handed with the gold. Sometimes even over-decorated, or gaudy, depending upon which word you want to use. But the Moser collectors are very enthusiastical, and some of the Moser gets quite expensive. Here's one of their typical patterns. It's the butterfly pattern. You can see there's a butterfly in the top, and there's a butterfly in the bottom section. Very, very intricate and busy. Here's the same pattern. This is in my last glass auction, and it brought a little over $5,000. Now, the top area is supposed to resemble honey flowing over this vessel, and same thing on the bottom. And when you look at the next close-up, you can see that the insects are stuck in the honey. You see the little bug beneath the, I guess, big flies and dragonflies. And you can see how intricate the enamel is on the body. But again, if you look at the line work enamel, you see how wide, it's not real thin, the gold that's painted on it. It overlaps on both sides. Here's a really great piece. This is one of the goblets that I have that is incredibly done. At the close-ups, the painting and the shading in the face and the eyes. In reality, even this photo doesn't do it justice. But then when you look at the bowl of it, this is another one of their typical patterns. It's the grape leaf and grape pattern. You'll see it on a lot of pieces that they do. You'll see it on a lot of stemware. So if you're going to collect this factory, one of the major traits is the repeat of specific patterns that they reuse over and over. Now, they did other lines that were less common with patterns, so when you get used to the other traits, it's easy to tell that it's Moser. This is the type of thing and pattern that you most find on stemware. In the Stein room today, you'll see that I have this exact pattern on 2 ruby goblets. It's identical. So it makes it real easy when I see that pattern to know that it's Moser. One thing that I will point out is that Moser made very few steins. So if you collect Moser and you collect steins, and you want a stein made by that factory, be prepared to pay a premium and be willing to pay a premium because they don't exist in great numbers. Again, if you look at the glass body, this body probably was made by Agerman, but it was decorated by Moser. It's a typical green or amber glass. You see the way you've got the spire coming out of the inlaid lid, which was typical of the pieces that have rolled and crescent shields. But yet, when you look at the way the gold work is done in the threading beneath the multicolored flowers, it's very typical of what Moser would have done. So here you have a combination of 2 factories working hand in hand. Again, before we had that ruby stein, the same kind of enameled flower work that was on that is on this 4-lobe juice glass. Another thing that Moser did, along with some of the other factories, is they had 2-tone gold. You see that part of the gold around that V of the design is very, very shiny, and then the gold within the V work is more of a matte or less shiny. So you've got different degrees of gold giving a contrast. Another thing that Moser did was layered enamel. You have flower clusters that are like stacked one on top of the other. They did a whole line of that. I've got some of these stems with me, and you have to really see in your hands. So anybody that has an interest in learning about this type and the traits, come and look at my table and you'll see what these really look like. Once you've had it in your hands, you'll see what I mean. It looks like somebody together until it got really high. Very hard process. It took a great deal of time. Here's a relief enamel piece, and the way this was done is they actually had a piece of ceramic that was attached to the body, pretty much in the shape of this parrot, and then they heavily enameled on top of it. Here's a close-up. This thing is really raised out from the body. The same thing with the acorns. The acorns are all applied to the body. They were glass pieces in the shape of an acorn, and then they would use just a transparent enamel, and that's just oil with the powdered glass mixed up. They would put it behind there, and when it was put to the kiln, it would attach that little piece of glass to the glass body. Pieces like this are very expensive and very sought after. I recently picked up this set. I've never seen it other than the champagnes. They're selling like hotcakes only because to a Moser collector, stemware with these applied birds don't exist. They're very, very rare. And this is the close-up of it. It was 72 pieces, and every single bird on every single piece was different. This is what they call the heart wines. You can see the center pattern of the bowl has a heart on it. The enameling is so delicate and so intricate. I had 72 of these, and within a few months they were almost all gone. And they were not cheap. They're $750 to $800 a piece. But yet, you have to pick one of these up in your hand to appreciate how intricate the design is. This is the same piece as the previous, only the stem is notched and faceted rather than the roller with fronts on it. And then you've got the champagnes. These are really, really gorgeous. Actually, one of my favorite in my collection. I put this in here only for the people that have an interest in Moser. This is an acid cutback. What they did is they put a stencil on it. They protected the area they didn't want cut with a grease. They dipped the whole piece into acid. The acid cut to this depth. They took it out, neutralized it, and then they painted the whole area, or gilded the whole area with gold and fired it. Moser, this is a typical Moser style. Most all of these are always marked Moser Carlsbad. And later on there, the factory, they marked almost everything, which made it easier. A factory that most people have not heard of is Josephina. Josephina was a very big factory, did a lot of glass work, and I've got a few examples. This is one of them. Their use of gold and their cell-like floral decoration is how you tell one from another. You'll see a very similar pattern on this piece as the previous one. And again, this is similar to those, only it's a goblet with some transparent enamel. It's not as easy to recognize as some of the other factories, but after a while, if somebody would keep pointing it out to you, you'd catch on. They did a lot of the, similar to Moser, the grape leaf and grape pattern. They did a lot of threaded enamel, and they did a lot of, all these stems are from Josephina. You can see it's almost a copper and then a gold. So it's the contrast and the shades of gold that are sort of an earmark for a lot of their pieces. This again, you've got the different degrees of color in the gold, and you can't see from this slide, but there's very intricate, small, transparent gold flowers within the gold, but they're very tiny, so you really need it in your hand to see it. Again, you see the copper and the gold. Another factory that is new to a lot of you is Theresienthal. Theresienthal was found up near Zwiesel, and Zwiesel is up by the Czech, Austrian-German border, northeast out of Munich. It was a very big glass-producing factory. They did a lot of different types of glass. I would have to say of all the factories, excluding Moser, their traits were all over the board. And you're going to see in the next shots how wide the range of techniques were and styles. Very, very hard to limit them to a few different traits. One thing that they did is they had a thicker enamel, and the enamel was always outlined with gold. That's one of their traits. Now, that's not everything they did, but when you do see a piece, like if you look at the sign here, that all the colors and the cells are outlined in gold. The same thing with this piece. This is a Theresienthal, a little bit thicker. It's not outlined in gold, but the type of coloring that you have on this is unlike some of the... If you're down into the flowers are outlined in gold, again. Same thing with this. You have a thicker enamel, and everything there is outlined in gold. Same thing with this. So it's just repetitiously, if you keep seeing the same things. If I set you in a room with 200 pieces of glass, and I said to you, just put things into categories that look similar, you would automatically, using your eye, do the same thing. You may not know what to call that factory, and that's pretty much how I started. I could say, well, that's the same as this, and that's the same as that, and then as soon as you find out what one piece is definitely, then you're able to link them all together. And that's basically how you learn. Again, if you look at this piece, you'll see that everything's outlined in gold. Okay, because of their geographical location, the Munich market was very important to the Theresienthal factory. You'll see a lot of Munich, as you see on this. If you look through the auctions, or back catalogs, you'll be able to pick out these amber glass pieces with Munich scenes on it, Munich crests or other crests from in that area. One trait of this factory is when they made steins with great pewter mounts. A lot of times you had pewter bases. You know, see, really nice relief lid. Here you've got a Bavarian crest, again, showing that the Munich market and the souvenir market there was very important to their production. Okay, this is a Holbein piece. Holbein sold his artwork to the Tracy-Toll factory. There was connection there. He not only made and sold designs to Betlock. This is one of his designs. And here's all the little ones, and each one of them is a different little Munich child. Again, you see, it's a glass inlay lid, and the pewter mounts are really done of great quality. Here's another Holbein piece. It's a big picture. And they made a whole series of tumblers and beakers, and one trait for getting the enamel is there was forced bubbles in the glass. The glass had a million little tiny bubbles in it, and then it would be enameled on top of it. When you see pieces like that, you know you're looking at a Tracy-Toll piece, as a general rule. Okay? Like I said, Tracy-Toll was really all across the board. Here's another piece that they made. The one thing that you really want to pay attention to is the three-twist stem that goes up from the top of the bowl to the foot. Really a neat stem. Another thing that they did that became quite popular in the Art Nouveau period is they did a lot of Art Nouveau transparent enamel stems. These are very sought after. There's a lot of collectors of this type of stemware. I would say I sell a lot of stems, and I would say that this type of stem sells the quickest and the easiest. Commands a pretty decent price. Again, there's actually a big tankard with a lid that matches these tumblers that I've had a couple of times. And the background from the Art Nouveau flowers is a frit enamel where they take powdered glass that's not quite ground down so fine, and they enamel it onto the body, so it gives it a real frosted effect. It's what I call frit enamel. These are two cordials done by Tracy-Toll. Again, transparent enamel. It's kind of funny that this size cordial is more sought after and more expensive than the normal size wines. More people collect those than the larger pieces. Again, another transparent enamel. Okay, like I said before, I was going to get into some other marriage beakers or marriage cups made by other factories. Again, the metal portion of the body is identical to the ones that we've seen previously by Fritz Hecker, but the body of this piece was enameled by Myers-Neff. Myers-Neff was a factory that worked almost exclusively for making things for Loebmeyer. Loebmeyer is a very famous quote-unquote factory, depending on how you want to look at it, retail store. In reality, they were a store in Vienna. They did not make glass initially, but they designed glass, and they had glass made exclusively for them per their designs that were copyrighted. Myers-Neff did most of their work. One of the traits about Myers-Neff that you want to look for is the white enamel that has gold painted on top of the enamel. I'm going to wrap this up real quick. Here's another one by Myers-Neff that was made for Loebmeyer that's multicolored, very intricate. Another Myers-Neff. There's very little difference between Myers-Neff and Loebmeyer because they were doing it for them. So in fact, who really made it? This is a signed Loebmeyer piece, but made for them by Myers-Neff. And real quickly, Loebmeyer eventually wound up buying their own glass manufacturing plant later on and actually made their own. So this is a transparent enamel for the Islamic market by Loebmeyer, another Loebmeyer piece. And even though I have some more slides, I'm going to conclude here.